Because I see there's attendees already, but yes, let's start it. So if you didn't hear me earlier, it is 6 o'clock. We will start in just a few minutes. You're welcome to always type your questions in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to be unmuted. Thank you for joining us today. Okay, so it is 6:03. So as promised, we're going to be starting. So thanks everybody again for joining us for a special Literary Thursdays. So my name is Casper, I'm manager of Camber Heights Library, and I'm joined with Indira, who's our co-host today. And we have a very special author for you today, so we're so excited. But first, the library announcements. So I know there's just one more day of this month, but it is Black History Month. So join Queens Public Library as we celebrate the powerful legacy of Black labor and its central role in shaping American history and culture. Our 2025 theme, if you didn't know it already, is African Americans and labor, which highlights the profound ways that work has intersected with the collective experiences of Black people. Pick up a copy of our Black History Month journal at your local library. Browse our curated book lists, all ages programs, and more at queenslib.org/BHM 2025. Borrowing a beloved book, learning a new language, taking a craft or fitness workshop, what's your favorite thing to do at the library? Get creative and show us. Submit a photo to the 8th annual Share Your Love for a Queens Public Library contest from February 1st to February 28th for the chance to win a special prize. We can't wait to see all the ways you love Queens Public Library. Learn more at queenslib.org/Library Lovers 2025. And finally, our last announcement, the Queens Public Library mobile app is your gateway to QPL services on your mobile device. With 96 language options, you can search our catalog, read, listen to, and watch our digital materials, view your account information, and so much more. Download the Queens Public Library app today for Android and iOS phones and tablets, and connect at connect.queenslibrary.org. So thank you so much for listening to the announcements, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Indira.
Thank you, Casper. Hello, everyone. My name is Indira Mukherjee. I'm the Assistant Manager, Information Access Services at the Central Library of Queens. And tonight we have with us Preeti Kanakumedala, the author of Brooklynites, the remarkable story of the free Black communities that shaped our borough. Preeti is a professor of history at Bronx Community College, CUNY, and also teaches at the CUNY Graduate Center, as well as being a proud Queens resident. She is an active public historian here in the city and has collaborated with Dance Space Project Inc., Place Matters, City Lore, Brooklyn Historical Society, which is now Center for Brooklyn History at Brooklyn Public Library, and Wicksfield Heritage Center. Brooklynites, the remarkable story of the free Black communities that shaped the borough, is her first full-length book and is currently a Gotham Book Prize finalist. And now I would like to present the author tonight, Preeti Ganagamadala. Take it away, Preeti.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to everyone. I normally start any talk with shout outs and gratitude. So I do want to thank colleagues and staff at Queens Public Library. Thank you so much for the invitation. Our libraries are the bedrock of a strong, active neighborhood, and we all know as New Yorkers, they are always severely underfunded, and librarians are often overworked. So thank you so much for doing this on top of everything else that you already do during the day in the library. I also want to thank the Brooklynites themselves, the folks that are honored and commemorated in this book. I say this with full heart. We owe a debt to these New Yorkers past who dreamed big dreams and really thought carefully and creatively about better futures for us all. Before I read, and I promise I'll sort of piece everything together, I did want to just sort of say three things that I need you to know before I start reading from the book. One is, in terms of history, New York State was actually the second to last northern state to abolish slavery. And while it might not feel like that some days at the moment, the idea that we've always been a liberal state doesn't really hold true. We have a really difficult past, and I really think it is worth unpacking what some of that means. The second thing I need you to know is why Brooklyn? Well, Brooklyn was the third largest city on the eve of the Civil War. It was a completely separate city from Manhattan, in the same way that you would talk about, say, New York and Los Angeles today. And so Brooklynites, quite understandably, have a very, very sort of proud association with their borough, which has its own unique and peculiar and difficult history. And the last thing I just wanted to share was this book has been 15 years in the making. I do consider myself a public historian, which means I don't only teach in the classroom at CUNY, but I do events like this. I do professional development workshops with K through 12 educators, who are some of the most wonderful educators in the city. I've spoken at old people's homes. So the reason for telling you that is Brooklynites, or this book, is just the latest iteration of the forms that this research has taken. And as soon as I stop reading, I'm happy to explore with you sort of what it means to be a public historian and to do this history. And sorry, I did say three, but I just want to say one more thing, just because I am a proud Queens resident. Like so many folks, I got priced out of Brooklyn almost a decade ago, some time ago. But I just want to say, when I say Brooklynites have lessons to teach us all, I am very careful about saying that. I obviously do acknowledge Queens and Queens history has a long, celebrated history of organizing and mobilizing and creating better worlds as well. But this is a glimpse at its 19th century history, hence I go to Brooklyn. I say that because I teach up in the Bronx, and I would never dare tell a Bronx resident either that Brooklyn has lessons to teach them. So with your permission, I'm going to read a little bit and then just sort of explore some of the themes and how the research came to be. Just going to share my screen. Awesome. If you cannot see the image, please let me know, but I'm assuming you can all see what I'm sharing. Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to read a little bit from the prologue, a little bit in the middle, and then a little bit at the end, so you get like a Cliff Notes version of this book. Brooklyn has a distinct story to tell in the history of social justice. From the end of the American Revolution to the start of the Civil War, Brooklyn expanded from one of 6 former colonial agricultural towns that lay on stolen indigenous land in Kings County to the 3rd largest city in the United States. And so the image you're seeing there in front of you shows you exactly what Brooklyn looked like in terms of being one of former 6 colonial towns in Kings County. And you can see how small Brooklyn was. As it did so, Brooklyn's small but growing free Black community, ordinary people from all walks of life, including business people, church leaders, educators, homeowners, journalists, laborers, and writers, sought to grow their city in a radical anti-slavery vision. The 19th century residents of Brooklyn Heights, Fort Greene, Weeksville, Williamsburg, and the areas we know today as downtown Brooklyn, Dumbo, and Vinegar Hill engaged in a multifaceted struggle as they organized and agitated for racial and social justice. They did so even as their own freedom was threatened by a magnitude of injustices, such as racial violence, systemic and structural racism, racial capitalism, and the potential for kidnapping into slavery in the South. These Brooklynites met in the city's churches, schools, parks, homes, public platforms, and private spaces. In choosing to live in or in close proximity to an emerging urban landscape surrounded by the vast New York harbor, they took advantage of a city on the rise in order to pursue economic opportunities and build and sustain their communities. Brooklynites, i.e. this book, tells the rich story of New York's 2nd largest borough and 4 sets of families from its 19th century free Black community: the Krogers, the Hodges, the Wilsons, and the Gloucesters, all of whom call this place home. It is a place-based cultural and social history of Brooklyn, and is a book about family, traditional biological ones, and the ones we intentionally create to strengthen our human bonds, that is, chosen family. The book restores the breadth and depth of the work of these 4 families, along with that of scores of other Brooklynites who displayed courage and conscience to expand our understanding of freedom. And it explores the ways in which these residents, both physically and politically, navigated their own city on a daily basis. It centers these families as fully formed persons and ordinary people first and foremost, and follows the contours and fragility of their own lives through births, marriages, deaths, and kinship. Even as they engaged in ambitious radical reforms of their city as political and intellectual thinkers. And why Brooklyn? Well, as the 3rd largest city in the United States for nearly 50 years, entirely independent and separate from Manhattan, which was then called the City of New York, it deserves its own focus. Though once considered just the western tip of Long Island, today it remains, a century after consolidation in 1898, the most populous borough in New York City. For large parts of the mid to late 20th century, Brooklyn remained in the shadow of, or as a subchapter to, Manhattan's own history. So Brooklyn stands proudly at the heart of this book as a site of scholarly examination and as a point of celebration and critique through historical analysis. In The Right to the City, the scholar and geographer David Harvey writes, quote, I'll just change the slide before I get to the quote. The question of what kind of city we want to be cannot be divorced from the question of what kind of people we want to be, what kinds of social relations we seek. The freedom to make and remake our cities and ourselves is one of the most precious yet most neglected of our human rights. End quote. Today, we owe a debt to the activism of these Brooklynites, and the legacy of their work is still immeasurable. Conceptualizing freedom remains essential to our humanity and the ways in which we make life. Our contemporary context for inequality in both New York City and the United States did not arbitrarily begin with redlining, segregation, deindustrialization, broken windows policing, and urban renewal in the 20th century. No, how we got here is deeply connected to the history of Brooklyn, specifically in the 18th and 19th centuries. Black Brooklynites and the white allies who would later join them mediated on and broadened the ideology of freedom, both for themselves and in deeply profound ways. They agitated for social justice in education, housing, safety, and voting, and challenged racial capitalism itself, which is very much part of their agenda. And these ideas continue to shape our vision of US democracy today. They knew emancipation was not a single historical event, but a series of moments in which freedom and liberty would need to be seized and molded in incalculable ways in their own lifetime and beyond. If today's present moment pessimistically reflects the country's long history and legacies of colonialism, genocide, slavery, imperialism, capitalism, gentrification, and displacement, through the rise of populism, racial violence, and deeply embedded anti-Black racism, I would say Brooklyn's Black communities have lessons to teach us all. History has never been one of linear progress. It remains in circular motion, with each revolution inching us slowly towards a more just society. This book, Brooklynites, is a story of necessity. In the stories of Brooklyn's 19th century free Black residents and their activism, history can be one of majestic hope, deep humanity, and love. This is a story of placemaking, of land, home, labor, of New Yorkers past, and the legacy they left us. This is the story of Brooklyn. And so the book starts at the slide that you should all be seeing, which is Francis Guy, who was an artist who drew images of both Manhattan and the village of Brooklyn back in the early 19th century, so the early 1800s. And what you're seeing here is the winter scene in Brooklyn. You can clearly see Brooklyn looks extremely different, right? This would have been the area we know today as Dumbo. The streets are irregular. The frame houses are certainly smaller. It's still crowded. It's still got the feel, I think, of Brooklyn. And I know maybe you can't see it that closely, but we definitely get a sense that this was a racially blended sort of neighborhood, right? The idea of segregated neighborhoods did not exist in early 19th century Brooklyn. There are people of British and Dutch descent in that painting, as there are people of African descent in that painting. I'm going to fast forward to talk about one of the families that is featured in this book. Let me just go forward and just look at the many kind of records that I used to put together this history. So this is one of my heroes. Her name is Mary Wilson. She lived in Brooklyn in the 1840s, 1850s, and she would leave by the 1860s to go teach in Washington, D.C. But while she lived in Brooklyn, a very proud Brooklyn resident, she actually owned a store. And after the Civil War, as the book goes on, she'll come back to Brooklyn and retire here. So here goes. Each fall, Brooklyn's busy Atlantic Avenue closes to one of the borough's oldest and largest annual street festivals. Since 1974, Atlantic Antic has celebrated the long history of capitalism and commerce along its road. Crafts, food, and market stalls line the street during the festival, partly against the backdrop of Cobble Hill's landmark historic district. The earth that forms Atlantic Avenue once belonged to the Livingston and Remsen families on stolen indigenous ancestral land. The Livingstons and Remsens would slowly parcel it off and sell it to private investors. In the 18th century, it morphed into a dirt road that ended at Ralph Patchen's farm, which overlooked the East River. In the Battle of Brooklyn, this site served as a fortification for George Washington's army. Eventually, Patchen's private dirt road became District Street and formed the southern boundary of the village of Brooklyn. In 1855, District Street was renamed Atlantic Street, ultimately transforming it into an avenue in the 1870s, and by the late 19th century, both Atlantic and Fulton were established commercial roads. By the late to mid 20th century, Atlantic was an economic hub for the Arab American community displaced from lower Manhattan's Little Syria. Today, the conglomeration of architectural styles and big and small businesses is captured in the triangle formed by the long locally owned Sahadis and the Damascus bread and bakery shop next door, which sit diagonally opposite the retail chain grocer Trader Joe's, housed in the former South Brooklyn Savings Bank built in 1924. The bustle of this part of Atlantic Avenue is markedly different from its west end, where the street meets the East River and car traffic impedes pedestrian flow due to the BQE's baffling design. But it was precisely here, at Atlantic's and Hicks Street, that a Black-owned business once thrived. In 1852, Atlantic was still 2 decades away from morphing into an avenue, but its radical transformation from dirt roads surrounded by cornfields to busy thoroughfare in less than a decade provided new commercial opportunities. That year, 30-year-old Mary Wilson opened her crockery store at 66 Atlantic Street. Located in a fashionable shopping district, her store was in a busy area of the city with further commercial and industrial activity as you headed westward. Here along the waterfront, the smells and noises from the factory of the glass manufacturer John L. Gilliland & Co., who was later renamed Corning, i.e. the maker of Corningware, would have been familiar to Mary and her customers, in the South Ferry, which began shuttling passengers from Brooklyn's Atlantic to Manhattan's Whitehall Street in 1836, ensured good foot traffic to the store. Given these factors, it is more than likely that Mary's store served Brooklynites and New Yorkers of all races and ethnicities. As a crockery store owner, Mary was part of a long history of entrepreneurial Brooklynites, fulfilling their neighbors' every dining needs. Crockery, particularly china, once a luxury of the rich, was especially in demand by middle and upper middle class New Yorkers and Brooklynites in the mid-19th century. Today, New York City's archaeologists rely on crockery shards and their remnants long buried deep in the city's soil as the single most retrievable product in digs to piece together the lives of New Yorkers past. The nature of Mary's business and its prime location would have been lucrative for her and her family, which included her educator husband, William J. Wilson, and in 1852, their then 8-year-old daughter, Annie. That is what you're seeing, by the way, on the slide. It is an image from the city directory taken from 1852, and it clearly shows you Mrs. William J. Wilson, and her name is underlined. And that is Mary. But the existence of Mary's business also indicates the ways in which ordinary Black women experienced capitalism and patriarchy, and how they navigated the city's changing political economy in their day-to-day lives. We know about Mary's store today because she is listed in the city directory for 1853, which was unusual even at that time. Although the city directory follows contemporary naming conventions and lists her as Mrs. William J. Wilson with the usual asterisk to indicate race, these directories normally only captured heads of households, which could also include widows. So what is unusual about the image you're seeing is that the city directory rarely listed married women regardless of race, even less so business women, and even rarer than that, a Black woman. But it is crucial to remind ourselves that rather than treating the exception as the norm, there were probably hundreds of Black women just like Mary Wilson, sustaining the city's economy in more informal ways. And while there might not be any written record of their commercial activities, they still deserve to be honored. So that's from the middle, and the middle of the book really does start to consider what were the economies that made Brooklyn's growth to the third largest city possible. And if you have any sort of ties or connections to Brooklyn, and you know that Domino Sugar Factory, which has since been bought by developers and is definitely no longer a sugar factory, it was sugar that would allow Brooklyn to become the third largest city in the United States. If the slave commodity of cotton made Manhattan, made the sort of money on Wall Street and made Manhattan the center of European capitalism, or rather the center of North American capitalism for Europe, I would argue it was sugar that was going to allow that for Brooklyn. And so I fast forward, we get to the Civil War, and then to round out the book, I start to consider from these 4 families, the children of those families, and the kinds of legacies that they left. The book starts at the end of the American Revolution, so in 1783, and it finishes somewhere about 1865 with the 13th Amendment. But then it starts to sort of give you hints that there is a story to be told beyond that. So I'm just going to read that bit, and then I promise I'll stop reading and just discuss with you where the research came from. In October 1869, Maritcha Lyons returned home. Having escaped the city of New York with her family during the terrifying days of the draft riots in 1863, she came back. But this time she relocated to the city of Brooklyn, where she began working at what we know today as PS 67, the Charles A. Dorsey School in Fort Greene. I'm just going to change the slide so you get an idea of quite how large Brooklyn is by the time Maritcha returns. Inspired by her parents' own sense of activism and her mother Mary's close involvement in fundraising for Black institutions such as the Colored Orphan Asylum in Manhattan, Maritcha knew how to organize and be in community. She worked together with sisters Sarah Smith Tompkins Garnett and Susan Smith McKinney Stewart, the daughters of Anne and Savannah Smith. Anne and Sylvana Smith, are some of the original land investors in Weeksville, which was the second largest free Black community in the United States, and Weeksville Heritage Center, which still very much exists on New York's cultural landscape, celebrates that legacy. So with whom Maritcha found companionship. Together, the three of them, they advocated for universal suffrage and ensured that Black women were included in these debates through their work in the Equal Suffrage League and the Women's Loyal Union of New York and Brooklyn. They were reminded in the late 1890s that there was still tremendous work to be done when they hosted the lecturer and journalist Ida B. Wells at the Brooklyn Literary Union in 1892. Freedom remained out of reach as long as racial violence, lynchings, and disenfranchisement continued in the US South. Ida B. Wells would dedicate the newspaper, the Memphis Free Speech, to quote, the Afro-American women of New York and Brooklyn. The scholar P. Gabrielle Foreman invites us to be attentive to the children as, quote, the elders organized, hosted, and traveled to such multi-day political meetings at the Black conventions in various states and towns, where they gathered them in the churches, and these children called home. And the children ate and slept in bedrooms even closer to home, end quote. The parents of this new generation of Brooklynites birthed the idea of a modern, culturally pluralistic democracy in the United States. In many ways, we are the lucky ones who bask in their legacy and must continue their struggle. Sorry, I'm just fast forwarding to sort of get to why this history is so important. These Black Brooklynites established an intellectual, political, and activist framework within notions of which, freedom and US democracy remain at the center of who we are today and with hope tomorrow. It is my honor to be able to write about the lives of people who graced Brooklyn streets long before us, especially right now. If we listen to the past, 19th century Black Brooklynites show us how to strategize against white supremacy, state-sanctioned violence, and structural racism. If we listen to the past, we may pay our respect to those who made certain freedoms a possibility. If we listen to the past, we can be a conduit for the knowledge they created and pass it on to the next generation. To Brooklyn. Thank you so much. That's me finished reading from the book that came out in September 2024. And I just wanted to speak to you a little bit, just for like 5 minutes or so, and then I would love to be in conversation with you all and sort of take your questions about where this project comes from. I am always very clear, even though this is an author talk or a book talk, and my name is very much on the cover of the book, and I certainly wrote every word of it, that none of this happens in isolation, meaning just in the same way that I celebrate communities and community building in the book and what it means to act as a collective, as a society, all of this research came out of a public history project that began 15 years ago, when I was not a full tenured professor in the CUNY system, but that I was actually an early career scholar, freshly out of graduate school with a PhD. And ironically, did not want to work in academia, but actually wanted to do history, wanted to do public history. And so I'm going to share an image from one of the many, many iterations that the research came out of, and that was an exhibit. 15 years ago, I first stepped foot into archives at what was then Brooklyn Historical Society in April 2010. And today, BHS no longer exists. It's now Center for Brooklyn History at Brooklyn Public Library, but still has all of those rich archives, and the building is exactly the same, but it is free and open to the public. And so what I began doing was working for a project called In Pursuit of Freedom, which brought together Brooklyn Historical Society, Weeksville Heritage Center, and a theater company called Irondale Ensemble Project. This was a public history project that came out of somebody's real life activism. The late Mama Joy Chattel was a resident along what was then Duffield Street. It's since been renamed Abolitionist Place. And in which the Bloomberg administration had said that they wanted to tear down the 19th century houses that were there and build a hotel, a park, a car park, in the way that development often happens in this city. It was because of that woman's activism, the late Joy Chattel's activism, and her daughter, Shanae Lee, that actually her house is still standing today. Because of the work that happened around the African burial ground back in the 1990s, the city is obligated to research any claim of Black history, that it was on the Underground Railroad or that it is a significant chapter of US history. And so there were scholars and archaeologists who came forward. They put together a tremendous report to say, the nature of the Underground Railroad, which is a network for formerly enslaved people to make a new life in the North, is not going to tell you that they had an attic or a tunnel in a building. But what we can absolutely be sure of, because of the presence of free Black communities in that neighborhood, there was the presence of three, some of the oldest Black churches in Brooklyn, and mutual aid societies and Black-led businesses, that it is more than likely that this was a center of Underground Railroad activity. And so, like most things that the city do, the houses got torn down apart from Joy Chattel's home, and the city sent out an RFP to cultural organizations to be able to recover the story of anti-slavery activism in Brooklyn. And so that is my entry into this project. Back in April 2010, I began researching and putting together with a team of exceptional community researchers and scholars and historians who were looking to piece together this history. And that would become the narrative that would eventually form the basis of 3 exhibits, K through 12 curricula, walking tours, an original theater production, and a website that you can still find if you type in Pursuit of Freedom Brooklyn. So the book, and I'm so sorry, so the image that you're seeing is some amazing, amazing New York City school children who came to the exhibit. The exhibit no longer exists. It came down in 2018, and you can see they're pulling on a sort of a rope or pulling on a thing of some sort in order to activate a screen. This the whole exhibit was about ordinary people doing extraordinary things in their activism. And so we were really keen that visitors didn't just walk into an exhibit and become passive, but that they're actively doing something themselves. And so that's what happened. You see the children there and they are physically pulling on something. So the book really is my love letter to Brooklyn as a historian and as somebody who's worked on this for 15 years. And it is just the latest format in which this knowledge and this like historical homage is created or exists. I would not have been able to do any of this work if it had not been for museum educators that I originally worked with the librarians and archivists, not just at what was then Brooklyn Historical Society, but we did research across the Northeast. So thinking about the National Archives, the municipal archives here in New York City. We also went up to Yale to look at a certain family's special collections. None of this is possible without librarians and archivists. The idea that a historian goes into an archive and discovers something, to me, is the most nonsensical fiction that we tell ourselves. It's just not possible, right? When you go into an archive or repository, you have a call number that you write down. You often have a title for the collection that you're asking for. And that is the labor of somebody who works in that repository or that library who has made that possible. So shout out to archivists and librarians who do that work every day. So my sort of framing of it is always what we do as historians and storytellers is that we go in and we recover things, right? That the onus is that these stories have always been told. Maybe they're being told within families, private families, rather than public displays. But that, and we've somehow forgotten the stories, right? We're not listening in the right ways to the stories being told, but not that these stories have been lost or that these stories need rediscovering, right? They need recovering. And so that is sort of where I'm at with Brooklynites and this book. It is my first full-length book. I'm hoping one day to revive those walking tours because they really were magical. There is nothing more special than walking on the land that New Yorkers past had walked on before us all. And to realize that that soil contains the sort of dreams and hopes of folks who came before us and really shaped their streets and neighborhoods in radical ways with huge radical possibility and imagination. So I do want to open it up to more of a discussion and questions and answers, only because I always think of this book as an invitation to further dialogue. So I would love to hear sort of where you're coming from or sort of if you've got any questions for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Preeti, for the wonderful introduction to your book. And I'm sure, people got an idea of what the book is about. Now, my question to you is, what aspects of the writing and publishing this book, I would rather say publishing process, did you find while writing it most challenging or most surprising?
Thank you so much for that question, Inder. I appreciate you so much. So I have written a version of this narrative in various ways. I've written it for an exhibit. I've written it for walking tours. I've written it for K through 12 curricula, and now the book. And I would say the most interesting part of publishing the book was that writing a book gives you, ironically, far more creative license to do things. You're no longer worrying, for example, in an exhibit, everything has to be visually led, right? You can't put a book on a wall and ask folks to read tons of pages. We know this to be true. Researchers of the 19th century know that they're very often not visuals of many of the people discussed in the book. Mary Wilson, I don't have a portrait for. It says so much about the ways in which portraiture worked, and power, and privilege and access to really technology that we take granted today with our selfies. So I think being able to honor Mary Wilson beyond just sort of the one panel that we had in the exhibit, but she's, weaved throughout, and she is within 4 chapters, has been sort of fascinating and revelatory, because I never really wanted to write a book. I don't consider myself that kind of historian. I would say the other thing is, I just want to shout out NYU Press. They are an academic press, but I was very clear to them that this book was aimed at the general public. And so while I am a historian within the CUNY system, I very much wanted this to be at an accessible price point, and I wanted the images to really pop, that you all have access to the very same primary sources and archives that I did. And they were very, very willing to go for it. It's often a huge cost to print those kinds of images, and especially in color. But shout out to NYU Press. They've gone above and beyond, and I'm just so very grateful.
All right, thank you. And we are getting some questions in the chat. So I guess let me take it from the top. One person, Randy, wrote a long note, and Randy said that they study Revolutionary War era attitudes towards slavery and the lead up to the Civil War and the mostly failures of the Reconstruction. And they said that they just started reading the book and they're on page 40, but they find it a breath of fresh air. And they said since November 6, 2024, so many, including myself, are afraid and disgusted, and Brooklynites is woke in all the best ways. And the little I have, I read, I adore. And they said that they live in White Plains and they would love for you to go to White Plains and autograph their book.
I would be happy to. I am very much. I consider myself a New Yorker, despite the way I sound. I've lived here for 20 years. I know no other home, and I have traveled all across New York City. I'd be happy to, or be at a local library, whatever's easier. Thank you so much for that note. I just want to point out. I know when I'm reading from the book now, some parts of it really are giving people chills, or it's resonating. I wrote this book a year and a half ago. I finished it, and I was writing it during when I had sabbatical. So I started in the summer of 2022. So just to think of a long game, that the sort of political world we live in now, New Yorkers past have seen a similar political world, and they learn to organize and mobilize. So I always hope that the book is a story of hope, and an invitation to build a better tomorrow.
I see there are, Randy wrote another note. He says, the first history course I took when I returned to college was a public history class. I'm so glad you approach Brooklyn's history through a public history lens. I believe there is no question, but he just wanted you to know.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And I think Mary, she said, so far as you know, did the Blacks whom you studied that lived in Brooklyn in the 19th century interact with the native Lenape people? And what was the presence of Blacks in Brooklyn during the earlier centuries? I have read that Venerable Pierre Toussaint had kinfolks, folks who lived in Brooklyn, and he is the wife of Juliet, often exchanged food and other things with them. They lived there from 17th to 1800s.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the question and the reference. So the research and the book does not focus on that, and it's not because it didn't exist. We absolutely have evidence of indigenous and people of African descent sort of communicating and creating community together. But there is a scholar, a hero of mine, Craig Stephen Wilder. He's a professor up at MIT. His book is Covenant with Color. And he very much does look at that time period from sort of European colonization to when the Lenni Lenape will be murdered or displaced, and what that contact would have looked like. So this book does not, but I do hope in the few passages in the very early bits, because it starts at the end of the American Revolution. But when I discuss Isabella, my hope is always that there's enough of a sort of honoring of the land that Isabella would eventually escape during the American Revolution. And that is absolutely a nod to indigenous ways of life.
Thank you. And Randy says that the maps and artwork in today's presentation and those in the book are gorgeous and illuminating. So I guess Randy's a big fan of yours. And also we have Kilo-san from Flushing Library. And Kilo-san asks, what are some intersections that you found between free Black communities in Brooklyn with other free Black communities in New York City, like Seneca Village in Manhattan or Black Dublin and Flushing, Queens?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. You know, there is so much work to be done on connections between free Black communities in Brooklyn and free Black communities in Queens. And I say that because I had a few threads Two did not end up making it into the book just because I was trying to really focus on those families. But there was a pastor up in Elmhurst or in Newtown. And he would often work with what was then the New York Society. It's NISMAR. It's the one that was in Manhattan, and it was led by former slaveholders. John Jay was the head, and I'm so sorry. New York Society for Mutual Relief? No, it was the other one. I'm so sorry. But they were anti-slavery society, even though that they were former slaveholders. It was white-led, and they would often, when slavery was still legal in New York State, so pre-1827, find enslaved people of African descent in Brooklyn who needed to fundraise. And they would connect them with this pastor whose name I'm blanking on so sadly, who lived in Queens. So there was clearly, like, common sense would tell you, there were so many examples of Brooklyn and Queens organizing together. In terms of Seneca Village, Elizabeth Gloucester, who again is featured in the book, she ends up dying one of the richest women in the United States. She owned land in Seneca Village. I don't know that she lived there, but she maybe was trying to get enough land so that her husband could eventually vote, because Black women, of course, did not possess the right to vote. So it was about Black men being able to vote if they owned enough land. And then, of course, there are connections between Brooklyn and Weeksville. Loads of connections, right? Maritcha Lyons was one of them that I spoke about. Sylvanus Smith lives in what is today downtown Brooklyn. He's one of the original 7 land investors. He will buy land in what will become Weeksville. He will never live there himself. And his daughters, Susan Smith McKinney Stewart and Sarah Smith Tompkins Garnett, won't live there long, but will make connections. So I think these were typical New Yorkers, proud Brooklynites for sure, in the same way that I still meet folks today who are like, I haven't lived in Brooklyn. I live in Virginia now. I've not lived, but I am a Brooklynite. So that these are people who are deeply embedded in Brooklyn as cultural identity, but like all New Yorkers, are making connections with folks in other places. Absolutely.
And Marina asks an interesting question. Marina is saying, have you met the descendants of the book? Do they still live in Brooklyn? And what was the reception of the book?
Thank you so much for asking that. So it's just to say there's a reason I don't talk about the descendants of the book in the book. And that was because I never, ever want that book to feel as though, again, thinking about I am the author of the book, that it is a sort of closed story, right? I've told the history of Brooklyn. I always wanted it to feel like an invitation or part of a larger jigsaw puzzle or dialogue to folks who do this history that includes the descendants of these families and other folks, Black New Yorkers who do huge amounts of genealogical research. And so, yes, descendants of of 2 of the families have reached out to me. But I'm always very clear about where my research begins and somebody else takes it or theirs begins as well. I would never, ever want to sort of create a situation in which their research becomes part of Brooklynites. It is very much their research and their story to tell. I think the richest thing we do in public history is that we have multiple storytellers. So yes, 2 families asked me very simple questions about how I came to this research, that they are the descendants of those families. And I hope one day, they celebrate their stories in their own way. And sometimes those stories are through the family reunion. Sometimes those archives and stories will still be in their attics or their photo albums. And all of those ways of existing are completely legit.
Thank you so much. There is a question which is Roz is asking. There is a range of families of varying classes and wealth in your book. Could you speak a bit more to how their work empowered them regardless of class?
You're
I
muted.
think you are muted.
Sorry, I'm going to stop sharing. I should have done that a very long time ago. I apologize. Yeah, absolutely. Roz, thank you so much for that question. If you couldn't tell, I'm not from around here. I grew up in Liverpool, England, another sort of very working class city and a port city that has a very parallel history to New York City in terms of what that waterfront meant for jobs, in terms of how it all fell apart when the waterfront was no longer a working port city, in terms of unionization and union busting and deindustrialization. So all of that to say, I come from a working class city and I am very class conscious. And this book absolutely does talk about the different classes within the free Black community itself. You have somebody like Elizabeth Gloucester, who died the third richest, one of the richest women in the United States, who was a Black woman. And you also have somebody like an Isabella, who runs away from this landscape and who is enslaved at the time of the American Revolution and fights for her freedom. There are scores of other women. Pomona Bryce is another one, formerly enslaved, lives in Brooklyn, and is fundraising constantly for her family to buy them out of slavery. The reason we know about Pomona Bryce is twofold. One is she fundraised, and that account book is still very much in the archives. And the other reason is because she ends up in the newspaper because she has unpaid taxes. So definitely wanted to shout out all of the different experiences that were happening, and never wanted to suggest that this was sort of a monolith or that everybody was having the same experience within these free Black communities.
Thank you so much. I would like to ask a question. It's like, how did your experience as a writer shape your perspective on Brooklynites, or I would say like immigrant experience in America? And or do you see these themes in your own life?
Thank you, Indra. I appreciate that question. So not to age me, but I'm a child of the late 70s, early 80s, and I grew up in a very different political context in Liverpool. We have a long history in Britain of South Asian and Black, Caribbean, West Indian organizing. So I definitely honor and really do take seriously the idea that we have to celebrate shared histories and shared cultures and shared experiences, shared struggles, to think collectively about both how we celebrate this history, but also to find solutions from the past for the present. So I came to this history as it was a job for hire. I was a public historian writing about it. But I think in terms of feeling at home in New York, one of the most beautiful ways this place can feel like home, even though it can be one of those maddening cities on the planet, is that you are constantly honoring New Yorkers past. Who are the shoulders of giants that you're standing upon in the work that you do? I am completely, sort of coherent about and acknowledge I would not be able to be, as a woman of color, a tenured professor in CUNY today had it not been for the radical possibilities and imagination and creativity of other people, specifically of African descent, in the late 18th and 19th centuries, who were fighting for the kinds of freedoms that I think we kind of take for granted today. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. You know, book banning is like the big thing in now. So I would like to ask you, how do you think the book banning affects any author's like creative freedom?
Yeah. Oh God, it's heartbreaking. It really is. I think it's such a heavy topic right now. Just your libraries in this city, whether it is Queens Library, Brooklyn Public Library, or the New York Public Library, are doing phenomenal work around book banning and literacy around book banning and what it means for all of us. And I do follow the three systems closely, and I do know every week or every month, librarians will shout out the books that have been banned and let you know exactly where you can get them from. So it's a huge part of our democracy and our freedom to be able to read books freely. You know, I was a young person growing up in Liverpool, England, and was reading constantly, you know, Malcolm X's autobiography, reading Zora Neale Hurston, so much stuff from the United States to understand sort of my own existence around being a person of color, in which very obvious acts of daily racism existed in Liverpool in the early 80s. You know, there was a huge backlash against immigrants, both Caribbean and South Asian. So huge amounts. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the work you all do as librarians.
Thank you. Um, I have another question, but we have questions over there too. But I would like to ask you what do you want people to walk away with from this book, the book you have written?
Thank you, Indra. I think it would be to practice hope. This is a story of hope in a really scary and racist time in this country's history, and in which ordinary people were really doing extraordinary things. They were dreaming big, not just for their own children, but for how this city can look. So I really do hope when you read this book, you walk away and you're practicing hope, right? The organizer, Mariam Kaba, says constantly, hope is a discipline. And that is what I hope for get out of it.
Thank you. And can you tell us about your writing style? How do you write in the mornings and the evenings? And also I heard that you like to write on trains. Is that true?
That is true, Casper. um, I wish I had a sophisticated answer for this. I don't. I write whenever it's possible. I have a 6-year-old, and as any carer or parent of a first grader will tell you, they take up a lot of time, quite understandably. So I really did. I wrote when I could. I tried to make it a practice. Again, writing community. I had a writing group that I wrote with. It was a bunch of us within CUNY who were working on books or articles at the same time. And I would just also write when I could. I'm an early riser, so I would wake up before my family wakes up and write then. I do love train journeys for writing, whether it's the subway or Amtrak or the Metro North, because it's a finite amount of time. So you're like, okay, I'm going to start writing, and I know I have to finish by the time I get to my destination. But the greatest advice I could give to anybody who's thinking about writing their family histories or local histories is reach out to other folks who are working. It doesn't have to be the same area as you, it doesn't have to be the same time period as you, but reach out to folks and create community.
Thank you. We only have a few minutes left. Randy asked a question, which I guess is a good question. They want to know, will you be writing another book?
Thank you so much, Randy. Yes, I am working on another book. It focuses on the DeGrasse family of New York City who lived in Manhattan in the early 19th century. The father or the patriarch's name was George DeGrasse. He's listed in the census as being from Calcutta, India, but he very much marries into a family, a long established Black family in New York. Becomes at the center of Black organizing in 19th century Manhattan. And there's a plot twist because Aaron Burr, the former vice president, will give them land to live on. So I'm trying to tease out what that all is. And I did notice, sorry, my Teams looks a bit strange today, but I did notice a question come up going, wasn't Liverpool sort of site of commerce for slavery? And I just want to say, yes, it absolutely was. That is why I am committed to this kind of work, because I am obsessed with how I'm a very proud Scouser and New Yorker. But as a proud Scouser, I'm obsessed with how these buildings, gorgeous 19th century buildings like the ones we have here in New York, came to be. And so it was part of that, trying to figure out where was this money made and what is the debt that we owe to folks as a result of it.
So, and is there a way for, I see that some people wanted you to join their book club or send you an invitation. Is there a good way for people to get in touch with you if they have more questions or if they want to learn more about you?
Thank you so much. Yes, because of my unusually long name, if you type in Kanika Maidala CUNY, I will come up straight away. My BCC, Bronx Community College email address will come up. You're very welcome to email me there. I also have a website. So again, if you type in my name, it's Preethi, Prithi, Kanika Maidala. My website will come up and there's a contact form there. But please get in touch. I would love to hear from folks.
So thank you again, Prithi. Thank you, Indira, for co-hosting. We had a really great time having you on with us today for Black History Month. We hope to have you again soon once you finish your second book. And next month in March is the start of Women's History Month. And on March 6th, we have Priscilla Morris, author of Black Butterflies. I hope everybody here will tune in next week. And thank you again, Prithi. It's been such a pleasure having you today.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you,
Thank
Pretty.
you so much, everyone.
I miss In Pursuit of Freedom. I love that exhibit.
Thank you, Rosalind. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Good night.
Bye, Preeti. Bye.